Powerful insights often occur when you least expect them. On Transformative Leadership Conversations, well, they're at the heart of every episode. Hi, I'm your host, Winnie da Silva, and together we're exploring a spectrum of leadership themes through the compelling stories and insights of seasoned leaders and prominent experts. And in each episode, you'll walk away with inspiration, strategies, and tools to enhance your leadership, build effective teams, and lead thriving organizations. So, this month on the podcast, we've been exploring one central question, which is this: how can leaders pursue excellence without exhaustion? If you remember, we began the series with Martin Reduglio in an episode called Caring Too Much at Work, where he shares his journey as a global creative and consulting executive navigating stress in high-pressure environments. Martin talked about how caring deeply for people and wanting to do things right, while it was also a strength, it became a source of stress for him. And his story revealed how high expectations, his own and others, can cause leaders to lose sight of themselves, and how awareness and self-compassion can bring us back into balance. Then we heard from Jan-Philipp Martini in the episode The Science of Sustainable Success, where he explained that Sapiens is built on one simple but powerful idea. By the way, Sapiens is the company that he founded and is the CEO. And it was built on one idea, that we can perform at a high level and at the same time work in harmony with our biology. He described how our bodies and brains are designed for natural rhythms of focus and recovery, and how ignoring those rhythms eventually leads to burnout. When we listen to those signals instead of fighting them, we create the conditions for sustained performance. Finally, in my joint episode with Martin and Jan-Philipp, in the episode called The Biology Behind Effective Leadership, we explored what happens when these ideas come together in practice. Martin described his experience going through Sapiens stress diagnostics and seeing for the first time how invisible stress patterns were showing up in his body, and how knowing the data changed his understanding of how his body responded to stress and how to work with his body instead of against it. Together, Jan-Philipp and Martin showed how awareness, data, and self-regulation allow leaders to perform at a high level without losing themselves in the process. So if you want to go deeper into any of those conversations, all 3 episodes are linked in the show notes, and we're before this episode right now. So if you had a chance also to listen to an episode which I posted back in April of 2023, which was called Mommy, Are You Scared? You already know my perspective on stress, because in that episode, I share a very personal story about being in a very real crisis with my youngest daughter during a harrowing ice skating accident, and how the stress and resiliency practices I teach were suddenly the very tools that I had to rely on in the moment. So rather than revisit that perspective on stress, during today's episode, which is the last in the series, I thought it'd be nice to build on the conversation that we've had with Martin and Jan-Philipp with a different question, which is this: how can rest help us achieve leadership excellence and high performance, and maybe more? And that brings me to something that my oldest daughter said to me this past weekend. So I was talking with her, and she's about to graduate from college next year. And she said something that genuinely made me stop and think. She told me this: that growing up, it never really felt okay to do nothing in our family. And that she also felt somewhat judged by the choices that she made to rest. So in other words, reading a book was kind of good rest, and watching a show on TV or maybe even simply lying on the couch was not. And she shared how this impacted her deeply, because without scrutiny, she had adopted these beliefs, which caused her to push herself in ways that she shouldn't. So without anyone explicitly saying it, she absorbed the belief that worth comes from doing, or that rest has to be earned, and that pushing through is better than slowing down. And then, on top of all that, she judged herself harshly when deciding not only when, but how to rest. And what she learned at home undermined her natural inclinations to listen to her body. So this was her example. So last week she had a cold with a cough, and yet she still pushed herself to go to her internship at the UN, attend her classes, and work at a restaurant job over the weekend. And I have to admit something. Before this conversation with her, I was feeling pretty proud that she pushed through and was being so reliable. But she pointed out that people around her kept saying, "Why can't you just rest?" So, yikes, chalk that up to another parenting fail. Because those are the very beliefs that I grew up in my family. So, I do struggle with resting, and I'm guessing that you do too. This all made me realize that while I understand the science of stress and resiliency, and I teach these concepts and tools to my own clients, I still carry some deeply ingrained beliefs about rest. And without meaning to, I pass those beliefs on to her. And yet, it's also not a black and white either or situation, right? Pushing through is not inherently bad. And in fact, perseverance is one of the most valuable strengths a leader can have or anyone can have, right? The real question is not whether we push, it's how far and at what cost. It's learning to recognize the moment when perseverance shifts from being a strength to becoming a liability. Leadership excellence requires that kind of discernment. It's knowing when determination serves us and when wisdom requires us to stop. On a recent podcast, I exposed the lie most leaders believe. If you didn't listen or watch that episode, the lie is this: doing determines my true leadership value. Now, in that episode, the topic was thinking versus doing. So, in other words, carving out time to think strategically versus doing all of the time. It's the difference between a leader who gets stuff done, right, versus a leader who has strategic and maximum impact. But you can see how the relationship between these two concepts come together, right? Because if you can't even slow down to be a strategic leader at work, then you are certainly going to struggle with full-on not doing. If you can't take time to think at work, it will probably be hard for you to take some time to do something that's restful outside of work. For about 10 years, I worked with a global strategy consulting firm to facilitate multiple leadership development programs in the Americas every single year. And in December, in one of those programs, during a Managing Stress and Building Resiliency breakout session, a participant shared something bold and really brilliant. So the CEO of this firm had sent a pre-holiday email to the firm saying something like this: "I hope you're able to rest and recover during this holiday season so that you can come back to work refreshed and ready for the new year." Okay, so what's wrong with that, right? Well, a consultant in the group called the whole premise of this email by saying this: "It feels like the deal is this. I work super hard at my job. Then I'm supposed to recover on my own time so that I can go back and work super hard again. But if all my recovery happens outside of work, my family only gets me when I'm exhausted." Huh, really some countercultural thinking right there, especially at a firm like that. High performing executives, usually by default, tend to think like this CEO. The priority is working hard. If I'm resting, it's about recovery only. But resting is more than recovery. Resting is more than the usual business benefits we attribute to it, like being more innovative, strategic, more present with our company, with our team members. Can we just think about resting as simply enjoying our lives? Oliver Burkeman, in his book, 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals, reminds us that if we live to be about 80, we only get about 4,000 weeks on this earth. Now, I'm not sure if that sounds like a lot of time or a little bit of time, but the picture he shows in the book, it looks really small. But when we hold our life in that framework, rest becomes something different. It stops becoming a luxury or something that we earn, and instead it becomes part of how we want to live our lives. Okay, so let's zoom out for a minute. I've been struggling with finding the right word to use to describe rest, recovery, but also the simple act of being human and enjoying our life. So I've kind of landed on the word revitalization. So what do you think about that? According to the dictionary, it means the act or process of giving new life or fresh vitality or energy to someone or something. I think that this gets the closest. I like this definition because the idea is that rest or simply taking time for ourselves can bring fresh vitality and energy to both our work and our life. I especially like that word process, right? So that process word makes me think that there are things that we can like kind of build into our lives that can help us achieve revitalization. So, expanding on this concept, I've got 3 ways to approach revitalization in a way that enables our ambitious, high performing leadership while also cultivating health, well being, and enjoyment in every aspect of our lives. Okay, so the first thing is awareness. So, this is a fact. If we plow through life and ignore how we feel emotionally and physically, our bodies, including our brains, will eventually break down. It's a fact. It'll break down by disease, by an attack of some kind. Something else will happen that will break that down. Now, at first, our bodies are polite, right? They start with some small warning signs, little flags telling us to stop or slow down. A tight shoulder, a headache starting to bloom, shallow breathing, maybe a small stomach ache, right? But if we continue to stonewall these subtle signs and we don't change anything, essentially, right? Those flags turn into sirens. And if those sirens are ignored long enough, our bodies move into full on strikes and shutdowns. Because you already know this. Once we are in full crisis mode, it is much, much harder to reverse things and recover. More damage always means longer recovery. But when we can catch these signs early, it's a completely different situation. What I'm saying is this: simple awareness is pure gold. Awareness opens up the possibility of choice. Do I need to push through? Can I take my foot off the pedal now, at least for a few minutes? When can I shift gears, if not now? Let me take a quick break and see if that helps. That stress and resiliency class that I mentioned earlier, I still teach that class today. And over these years, it has been the best forcing mechanism for me to help me become acutely aware of my own stress signals. Learning to pay attention has really been a game changer for me. Okay, number 2, rhythm. If you listen to my conversation with Jan Philipp titled The Science of Sustainable Success, which is the second episode in this series, you probably noticed how often he talked about rhythm. His team at Sapiens studies and tracks it. And one of their primary goals is to help leaders actually see the hidden and unique rhythms that their bodies and brains have. Things like heart rate variability, how quickly or slowly your system recovers after a stressful moment, and the way your energy rises and falls throughout the day. What struck me most is that none of these patterns are linear. They are more like waves. They rise, they peak, they crash, they recover. They expand and contract. They signal when we're open and creative and when we need stillness and space. These biological rhythms are not evidence of weakness, of course. It's just us being human. Jan Philipp also talked about something that we rarely consider. He said that most of us try to force our bodies into performance patterns that match our calendars and our projects and our boss's requests, right? Rather than our biology. Like back-to-back meetings, endless deadlines, no space to breathe or to shift gears. We expect our energy to climb on command and stay elevated simply because our work, our calendar, or our boss demands it. But our biology does not work like that. And if we ignore those natural rhythms, we do not just get tired. We lose creativity, perspective, compassion, and wisdom, which are the very things that make us excellent leaders. And they will begin to erode because we have pushed our system into something that it was never built to sustain. Our bodies and brains were built for concentric circles, not those linear lines. Our lives and our bodies move in seasons with texture and color that shift throughout the year, the week, and even the day. We are not meant to force ourselves into monochromatic, one-tone grinds that look and feel the same every single day. And this is where awareness and rhythm meet. So if we want excellence without exhaustion, we have to pay attention to the signals our bodies give us and learn how to work with our rhythms instead of against them. When we begin to be aware of our signals early, we start to see those rhythms more clearly. We begin to recognize the natural patterns in our energy, our focus, our irritability, and our creativity. Okay, number 3, awareness shows us what is happening in our bodies. Rhythm helps us understand when and why those patterns emerge. But we all know that insight alone isn't enough, right? The next step is to create change by practicing our leadership differently. And this is where tiny experiments come in. Anne-Laure Lecomte, who wrote Tiny Experiments, How to Live Freely in a Goal-Obsessed World, offers a simple but powerful idea. By the way, it's a great book and I recommend it highly. So instead of trying to overhaul our life, run small experiments. Try something new at scale so small that it feels safe and doable and sustainable. The goal isn't to solve everything, and certainly not at once. The goal is to learn, evolve, and change. Tiny experiments work because they reduce the pressure we put on ourselves. They lower the emotional cost of starting, and they build evidence that change is possible, which can slowly rewire how we respond to stress. If awareness is noticing tension in your shoulders, right? Rhythm is understanding that this tension always hits around 3 o'clock. And then practice is running tiny experiments to interrupt that pattern before the tension starts. For example, a tiny experiment might be standing up between Zoom calls and doing some deep breathing for 60 seconds. In fact, let's lower the bar. Let's say it's 30 seconds. Or maybe you take a short walk. That could be like around the house or around the block. Or getting a drink of water before your next call. Or taking the first 2 minutes of your day to write down whatever's swirling in your head before it builds into anxiety later. Try one of these and see how your body responds. So I'll give you an example of an experiment that I've tried that's really worked for me. So when I wake up in the middle of the night, worried about something, I used to lie there and think about it for like an hour or more. Now, when that happens, I get up and I write it down, and then I try to go back to sleep. It takes the worry or anxiety literally like physically out of my head and puts it somewhere concrete that's not in my head. I mean, it could still stay in my head, but the idea is that I put it outside of my head. That tiny experiment has cut down the time I have spent ruminating at night. It doesn't solve the problem, but it interrupts the stress loop that my body has so that I can settle back and try to go back to sleep. Another bonus from that tiny experiment, whenever I look back on those notes, you know what I realize? Not one of those things is worth staying up all night for. And I remember that when that happens again in the middle of the night. Is this worth staying up all night for? Either way, I write it down. But it is an insight that helps me get back to sleep much more quickly. Okay, so the bigger point is this. Practicing tiny experiments helps us steer our stress response before it takes over. We can learn our patterns, try some small shifts, and see what happens and what helps our system come back to the center. And these micro practices, they really add up. They teach us what restores us and what drains us. They give us data about our own biology and our own preferences, and they help us build habits that support excellence without sacrificing our well-being. I'll add one more thing. It came to me this week that allowing myself to rest, to prioritize revitalization, is really also a practice in humility. Because what I'm ultimately saying to myself is that I can't do it all. And I can't do it all by myself. Rest is about mentally and physically surrendering to the possibility, the need, or really the reality that I need help. What follows is this question: who could help me? Who could I collaborate with? What am I missing that I haven't thought about on my own? And for me, surrendering to revitalization actually becomes a spiritual practice that reminds me that I'm not the source of everything and that I can rest in something larger than myself. As we close this month's series, remember this: excellence without exhaustion can come with awareness, rhythm, and practice. So before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a few questions to help you take this month's ideas into your own leadership. What signals has my body been sending me lately? Throughout the day, where do I notice natural rises and dips in my energy, my focus, or my creativity? And what is the one tiny experiment I could try this week that might interrupt a stress pattern before it takes over? You don't need to overhaul your life or take a year sabbatical or meditate for an hour every day, although these might be really nice and maybe long-term goals that you have, right? But instead, do just one small thing, one moment of awareness, one shift in your rhythm, and one tiny experiment. Thank you for listening and for spending this month with me as we explored excellence without exhaustion. Next month, we'll shift gears to another essential dimension of leadership, confidence. We'll explore what true leadership confidence looks like, where it comes from, and how we can strengthen it without slipping into self-doubt or overconfidence. I hope you'll join me for that series. Okay, one more thing I want to add. For listeners of this podcast, Sapiens is offering 20% off of their stress and resilience diagnostic and habit change program. Just use the podcast code TLC when you sign up. The offer is valid through the end of 2025. So what's included in this change program? It's a 4-month journey that begins with an at-home diagnostic, which includes a stress, hormone, and cortisol analysis, ECG monitoring, and recovery analytics, followed by 3 months of expert-guided habit coaching and monthly progress tracking. So if you're curious or still deciding, you can book a free 15-minute consultation with someone from the Sapiens team. They'll walk you through what to expect and help you figure out if it's right for you. There's a direct link to the show notes to make this scheduling quick and easy, or you can visit directly the Sapiens website, which is www.b-sapiens.com, and you can get all the details there. If you're ready to take your leadership to the next level or empower your teams for success, I am here to help. Reach out to me directly at winnie@winifred.org or check out my website at www.winniedasilva.com to learn more about my work in coaching executives, developing critical leadership skills, or working with clients to build effective teams. You can also find me on Substack, LinkedIn, and YouTube. I'd love to hear your reflections or suggestions for future topics, because you are always welcome to take a seat at the table where every conversation has the potential for transformative change.